Hi, DIY Jeff, and today I'm going to show you how to replace these struts and strut mounts on this 2006 Ford Mustang.
DIY Jeff, a place to find helpful how-tos and honest reviews.
It will take some time to complete, but I'll show you step by step how to do it, and it's really not that difficult. So let's get started.
Before jacking up a vehicle, be sure to chock the back wheels. If you're not using an air gun to remove the lug nuts, then also loosen the lug nuts first before you jack the vehicle. Under the Mustang is a cross frame support, which makes an ideal location to jack the vehicle from. Jack the vehicle, insert a jack stand, and lower the jack until the vehicle is firmly rested on the jack stand. The lug nuts on my Mustang require a special lug tool, making an impact gun necessary. The lug nut tool requires a 13/16 socket. Remove all 5 of the lug nuts. They don't have to come off in any particular order. Once the lug nuts have been removed, the tire can be pulled off and rolled out of the way. Next, I'll remove the caliper and caliper mounting bracket. There are 2 bolts holding the caliper to its bracket. Using a 12mm socket, you can either use a socket wrench, or if you have an impact gun, it will make the work much quicker. To remove the caliper, wiggle it up and down until it comes loose. Friction of the brake pads on the rotor are what's holding it in place. Temporarily hang the caliper with a bungee or a rope so there's no pressure on the brake line. Here I hung it from the coil spring of the strut. You could also set a box on the ground and support it that way instead. There are 2 15mm bolts holding the caliper mounting bracket in place. Once removed, the bracket will slide right off and can be set aside. If your rotor has never been replaced, then it probably has a retaining clip holding it onto one of the lugs. Use a flat head screwdriver to pry it loose. It may take some coaxing. Once it's pulled out a little, grab some pliers and bend it off. The goal here is for the metal to rip. You won't need it during reassembly. If you're lucky, the rotor will slide right off at this point. However, mine are the original rotors and they're stuck on really tight. You can try tapping on the back side of the rotor with a rubber mallet, and sometimes that works. But in my case, I had to switch to a hammer. You can try to tap the center from the front, taking care not to hit the lugs, and sometimes that will break the rust free. If that doesn't work, hit it from the back side. I'll be replacing my rotors at the same time, so I'm not worried about ruining the rotors. But if you're not replacing your rotors, do not hit the rotor surface with a hammer like I'm doing. After a few taps, the rotor should break loose. Here you can see what the hammer did to the braking surface. Next, we'll remove the 10mm bolt on the back side of the strut that holds the brake line in place. If your Mustang is equipped with ABS brakes, then there will be a plastic retaining clip holding the line in place. Use needle nose pliers to squeeze the end and push it through from the back side. With the ABS and brake line free, you can now set the caliper aside on a box, freeing up the coil. The strut rod is held in place with an 18mm bolt. You can attempt to use an impact gun, but as you can see, the bolt will most likely spin. It's designed this way for safety reasons so the rod can't fall out from vibration. I don't own an 18mm wrench, so I used an adjustable wrench on the nut and an 8mm wrench to turn the rod. It's designed this way by the manufacturer. It will take some time, but it isn't difficult. Turn the rod clockwise, which will then turn the nut counterclockwise. put the nut back on the rod, which will make keeping track of it much easier. I'll be taking the strut mounting bolts off next. They can be difficult if you're not using an impact gun, so I suggest spraying some lubricant on them, like here I'm using liquid wrench. The bolts are 21 millimeter. Once removed, the hub will rotate forward, freeing the strut. So the control arm doesn't take all the load, I suggest using a jack stand to support it. At this point, the only thing holding the strut to the car are the 4 13mm nuts on the strut mounting bracket. After taking off 3 of the nuts, put your hand on the strut below to support it before removing the 4th nut. The strut weighs about 30 pounds, so be ready. To remove the strut mount and coil from the strut, it's best to place it on a solid device like a vise to hold it steady. It's not absolutely necessary, but it does make it a lot easier. At the top of the strut is a retaining nut. I'm pointing it out, but don't remove it yet. The coil is under tremendous pressure, and if you remove it before you compress the coil, it could cause serious injury. Using a set of coil compressors, set them up on the coil across from each other. This way, when the coil is compressed, the tension is spread evenly amongst the coils. You can use a 1/2-inch drive ratchet, but an impact gun makes quick work of it. Don't tighten one side completely. Do it in small increments. The goal is to have a good sized gap between the coil and the strut mount. If there's a gap, it means that there's no pressure being put on the strut mount by the coil. You can try to use an impact gun to loosen the strut retaining bolt, but much like the strut rod, it will most likely just spin. Use the same technique as the strut rod. Use a 21 and 10mm wrench, and use the 10mm wrench turning it clockwise, which will loosen the nut. With the nut removed, the strut mount can now be removed. As you can see, mine came off in 2 pieces. This isn't supposed to happen. It's supposed to be one solid piece. Next, the coil can be pulled off, but be careful when setting it down, remembering that it is still under a lot of tension. The dust cap and the bump stop slide off the strut. You'll need both of these to put back on the new strut. I'm upgrading my stock struts with Monroe Sensitrack struts. I'll put a link down in the description if you're interested in where you can find them. I always like to compare a new part with an old part to make sure it's the same one before I go to all the trouble of trying to install it, mainly looking at the mounting holes and matching them up. As you can see, this is the original Ford strut. Now let's compare the old strut mount on the right with the new one on the left. If your old strut mount is in good condition, then there's no need to replace it. But since mine are no good, I took the opportunity to upgrade to Racing GT500 strut mounts for tighter handling. I'll put a link in the description if you're interested where you can find them. The new strut should come with a new retaining nut. Remove it and then press down and turn counterclockwise to release the strut tension. As you put the coil back on, make sure you're putting it on in the same orientation it came off. One way to do this is by looking at the spring compressors, noting that the drive opening should be on top. Seat the bottom end of the coil against the indent in the strut. Place the bump stop and dust cover back on the strut. When placing the strut mount on the strut, match up the notch in the mount to the end of the coil spring. Tighten the retaining nut as far as you can by hand. Then finish tightening it with the 21 and 10mm wrenches you use to take them off. To gain more leverage, I'm turning the larger wrench and holding the small wrench in place. If using this technique, the large wrench is turned clockwise. The process is slow and it may take a minute or two. It's supposed to be tightened to 46 foot-pounds, but since it would just spin if you're using a torque wrench, tighten it as tight as you can with the 2 wrenches. Slowly release the coil tension until the tensioners are loose. The coil should be seated against the cutout in the strut mount. If it's not, recompress the coils and move the strut mount into the correct orientation and then release the tension again. Position the strut assembly, lining up the strut mount bolts, and then secure it with a nut. Then you can let go of the strut and hand tighten the remaining nuts. Remove the jack from under the wheel spindle and then line up the strut with the wheel spindle and insert the bolts. For good measure, put some blue Loctite on the threads since this part of the suspension takes the most vibration. Tighten the bolts up and then we'll torque them to spec later. To insert the stabilizer bar link into the side of the strut, you'll have to use a jack under the wheel spindle and raise it up until the stabilizer bar link easily slips into the hole. Hand tighten the nut, then using the same technique as we did for the strut top nut, use an 18mm wrench or an adjustable wrench and an 8mm wrench and tighten the nut as tight as you can. It's supposed to be torqued to 85 foot-pounds, but again, it's not possible to use a torque wrench on it, so just get it as tight as you can. Now you can torque the strut to wheel spindle bolts. They'll need to be torqued to 148 foot-pounds. Use a 10mm socket and tighten the brake line onto the back of the strut and torque it to 30 foot-pounds. If you have ABS brakes, make sure to reinsert the ABS brake line retaining clip. Tighten down the strut mounting bolts in a crisscross pattern. Finish by torquing them to 26 foot-pounds. I'm putting on a new rotor here, but if you're reusing your old one, put it on now. You may notice that the caliper hardware has been painted red. If you want to see how to paint calipers, I'll cover that in another video and link it in the description when it becomes available. Hand tighten the caliper bracket bolts and then use a 15mm socket to torque them to 85 foot-pounds. Before inserting the caliper guide pins, it's a good idea to apply a light layer of grease on them. I'm also replacing my brake pads, but if you're not, it's still not a bad idea to put a light layer of anti-seize on the metal portion of the pad where the caliper makes contact with it. The easiest way to insert the pads is to insert them by turning them 90 degrees and then turn them into place. This method works the best. Now, set the caliper over the pads. Press in on the brake pads until both sides of the caliper fit over them. Then insert the caliper guide pin bolts and hand tighten them. Use a 12mm socket and tighten them to 25 foot-pounds. Spin the rotor, checking it to make sure that it's rotating freely and not binding up on the brake pads. Now you can put the wheel back on. Hand tighten the lug nuts and then tighten them with a wrench. I prefer this method over an air gun just so I don't accidentally cross-thread the lugs. Jack up the vehicle, remove the jack stand, lower the vehicle, and torque the lug nuts to 98 foot-pounds. And don't forget to remove the wheel chocks. And that's it. That's all there is to it.
I hope this video was helpful for you. If it was, give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to my channel. Also, click the bell icon next to the subscribe button and you'll get notified every time I upload a new video.
DIY Jeff, a YouTube channel where I'm not gonna lie to you.